My name is Renata Voss, and I'm 33 years old. The first thing I heard when I surfaced from anesthesia was a nurse saying the word hysterectomy, like it was already finished. I thought I was still dreaming. I was not dreaming. I'm a family law attorney. I spend my days reading documents other people didn't read closely enough. Custody agreements, guardianship petitions, powers of attorney. I know what a signature means. I know what a date means. I did not know, lying in that recovery bay with an IV taped to the back of my hand, that both of those things had already been used against me. 6 hours earlier, I had walked into Cedar Grove Memorial for what my surgeon called a routine laparoscopic procedure. Endometriosis, a cyst on my left ovary, nothing my pre-op consultation hadn't already mapped out in detail. I had signed my own consent form. I had specified, in writing, that if anything unexpected was found, the surgical team was to attempt the most conservative option available and preserve my fertility. My husband Marcus knew this. We had talked about a second child for over a year. What I did not know, what nobody told me until I was already unconscious on a table with my abdomen open, was that 6 weeks earlier, Marcus had gone to the hospital's patient portal desk during a separate appointment and quietly changed the healthcare proxy on my file. Not to himself, to his mother, Diane Voss. I woke up without a uterus. I lay there for a long moment, listening to machines beep in a rhythm I didn't control, doing the math a lawyer does before she does the math a wife does. Someone had to sign for that. Someone had to be asked, and someone had to say yes, and it was not going to be me, because I was not conscious. So who was it? Diane Voss has never liked me. She has been careful about it, the kind of dislike that wears cardigans and brings casseroles. For 9 years she introduced me at parties as Marcus's wife, before she ever used my name. She once told my daughter Lily, who is 4, that some women are career women, and some women are family women, and left the sentence hanging there for me to finish. I never did. I let her think what she wanted. I should have paid closer attention to what a woman like that does when she's finally handed a pen. There was a Sunday, 2 years ago, when Diane brought over a stack of parenting books she thought I should read, each one dog-eared to a chapter about career mothers and the sacrifices they supposedly owed their families. I thanked her and put them on a shelf I never opened again. I did not fight her for it. I have spent my whole career telling other people's mothers-in-law that boundaries require enforcement, not just declaration, and I still didn't enforce my own. That is the part of this story that stings the most when I'm honest with you. A nurse named Priya came in to check my vitals about 20 minutes after I woke up. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage with a throat still raw from the tube, who had authorized the additional procedure. She hesitated the way people hesitate when they already know the answer is going to hurt someone. Your husband's mother, she said. She's listed as your healthcare proxy. It's in the chart. I asked her when that was entered. She didn't know, but she said something I will not forget, because it was the first sentence in this entire story that felt like the ground shifting under a house that had looked stable for years. It's dated, she said. Everything in the system is dated. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to. Somewhere in a database at Cedar Grove Memorial, there was a timestamp, a day, a time, a signature. Proof of exactly when my husband decided I could no longer be trusted to make decisions about my own body, and proof that it had nothing to do with an emergency, because there was no emergency yet. There was just a decision, made in advance, and hidden from me for 6 weeks while I planned a nursery I would never use. Tell me something. If you woke up tomorrow and found out someone had made the most permanent decision of your life without asking you, and that they'd set it up weeks in advance, quietly, waiting, would you want to know exactly when they decided you didn't matter enough to ask? Because I did, and I found out the paperwork could tell me. Marcus walked in 20 minutes later holding 2 coffees and a look on his face I used to mistake for love. He said my name softly, like a man testing whether a smoke alarm was really going to go off. I looked at him and I did not cry, because crying was for later, in private, on my own terms. I asked him one question. Did you know what she was going to say yes to? He set the coffees down very carefully on the tray table, the kind of careful that tells you a person has already rehearsed their next few sentences. And that was the moment I understood This had never been about one bad decision made in a panic. This had been planned. I just didn't know yet how long, or how far it went, or how many people had known before I did. I met Marcus Voss when I was 26, at a fundraiser for a legal aid clinic I volunteered with on weekends. He was easy to like, charming in the unthreatening way that made older women trust him with their purses, and younger women trust him with everything else. We married 2 years later. In a backyard ceremony his mother helped plan down to the napkin folds. I should tell you now, so you understand what I missed. Diane Voss did not want him to marry me. She wanted him to marry a woman named Claire Bennett, the daughter of her book club friend, a woman who had, in Diane's words, old family values, and no interest in courtrooms. I heard about Claire secondhand, at first, from a cousin who thought I'd find it funny. I did not find it funny. I filed it away instead, the way I file away every fact that later turns out to matter. For the first 4 years, the friction stayed small. Diane corrected my parenting in front of Lily. Diane rearranged my kitchen when she visited, to make it more efficient. Diane once told a room full of relatives that it was unusual for a mother to work as much as I did, and then smiled at me like she'd paid me a compliment. Marcus called these things just how she is. I called them tests, and for 4 years, I kept passing them, because passing felt easier than the alternative. The pattern I missed was quieter than any single incident. It was the accumulation. In March of last year, Diane asked Marcus, not me, whether we were done having children, phrasing it like a woman inquiring about a renovation timeline. In July, she brought up, unprompted, that her cousin's daughter-in-law had made the smart choice and had her tubes tied after her second child, so there'd be no more surprises to manage. In September, at Lily's birthday party, she asked me directly, in front of 6 other mothers, whether I really thought I had room in my schedule for another baby. I told her that was between me and Marcus. She smiled and said, "Of course, dear. I only ask because someone has to think practically." I thought she meant me. She meant herself. My key mistake, and I want to say this plainly, because I think a lot of women make it, was believing that a marriage with a difficult mother-in-law was still, underneath, a partnership between 2 equal adults. I believed Marcus was managing his mother, the way you manage a difficult client, politely, at a distance, without letting her touch anything that mattered. I did not understand that he had never actually drawn that line. He had simply let her believe she still had authority in our house, because disagreeing with her cost him more than agreeing with me did. Here is a detail I didn't understand the weight of until much later. In February, 6 weeks before my surgery, Marcus took a half-day from work to handle some insurance paperwork at Cedar Grove Memorial. I remember because he picked up Lily from preschool that day, something he almost never did, and I remember thinking it was sweet. I did not ask what the paperwork was. I trusted him the way you trust a floor you've walked on 1,000 times without checking for rot. What I stood to lose, if I had known to calculate it, was staggering. Not just a uterus. My ability to have another child had been, for over a year, one of the few decisions in my adult life I had insisted on making entirely for myself. Not for Marcus, not for Diane, not for anyone's family narrative. It was mine. And somewhere in a hospital office on an ordinary Tuesday, my husband had quietly signed away my right to be the one who decided. His mother did not force her way into that authority. He handed it to her. That distinction is the whole story, if you're paying attention. Everyone wants to talk about the mother-in-law who overstepped. Almost nobody wants to talk about the husband who opened the door and stepped back. I found out later, from Marcus's own sister Catherine, that Diane had told her the surgery was a blessing in disguise, because now, in Diane's words, Renata can finally focus. Catherine told me this apologetically, the way people confess things they should have said months earlier. I thanked her. I did not blame her. I was too busy doing what I do for a living, building a timeline, one confirmed fact at a time. There was one more incident I hadn't weighed correctly, until I started looking backward instead of forward. The previous Thanksgiving, Diane had asked to host at her house instead of ours, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that she spent 20 minutes alone with Marcus in the kitchen, while I set the table with Catherine, and when they came back out, Marcus wouldn't quite meet my eyes for the rest of the night. I asked him about it in the car. He said his mother had been stressed about her knee surgery and needed to vent. I believed him, because I had no reason yet to build a file on my own husband. I understand now that Thanksgiving was 3 months before the proxy change. I will never know exactly what was said in that kitchen. I know the timeline, and the timeline is enough. My own mother used to tell me that you can measure a marriage by who a man protects when the room turns against you. I used to think Marcus protected me. What he actually did, I came to understand, was manage me, soften the edges of Diane's behavior so I would tolerate it a little longer, smooth over her comments so I wouldn't push hard enough to force him to choose a side. Protection and management look almost identical from inside a marriage. It is only afterward, with the documents laid out on a table, that you can see clearly which one you were actually given. Marcus sat down in the vinyl chair beside my hospital bed and started talking before I asked him anything else. That should have told me everything. Guilty people fill silence. Innocent people let it sit. It was an emergency decision, he said. The doctor said there was a mass, and it was moving fast, and someone had to say yes. My mom was just trying to protect you. I asked him a simple question. Then why does the healthcare proxy form show a signature date from 6 weeks ago? He blinked. He hadn't expected me to know that detail yet, because he hadn't expected me to be conscious enough, this soon, to ask a lawyer's question instead of a wife's question. That's just paperwork, he said. It doesn't mean anything. It means everything, I said. It means you decided, before there was any emergency, that if a decision ever had to be made about my body, it wouldn't be me making it. He tried the next move, the one I'd watched 100 opposing parties try in custody hearings. He minimized. You're exhausted. You're not thinking clearly. Can we not do this right now, while you're recovering? I want you to notice what he did there. He didn't deny the timeline. He asked me to stop noticing it. Diane arrived 40 minutes later, holding a bouquet of pink carnations like she was visiting a woman who'd had good news. She kissed my forehead before I could stop her. You'll thank me one day, she said, patting my hand. I did what needed doing. Somebody had to be the adult in this family. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I looked at her and said the only sentence I had prepared. You are not my mother, Diane. You were never supposed to be the one signing for me. She laughed. Actually laughed, and said, well, someone had to be. You were unconscious, dear. As if that settled it. As if unconsciousness were a vacancy she was entitled to fill. That was the moment. Not the surgery, not the coffee cups. That laugh. Something in my chest went still, the specific stillness of a decision being made below the level of thought. I was done explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was before they asked. I want a copy of every document with my name on it from this hospital, I told the room, in the voice I use in a courtroom, not the voice I use at home, today, before I'm discharged. Marcus said my name in the tone he uses when he wants me to lower my volume for the sake of appearances. I did not lower it. I'm not asking a second time, I said. Diane tried a different tactic, the one I have watched 100 difficult witnesses try. She turned soft. Renata, sweetheart, you're in pain. You're not yourself. Let's not make this into something ugly. I have heard that sentence structure in deposition rooms my entire career. It is designed to relocate the ugliness from the act onto the person naming it. I did not take the bait. I am completely myself, I told her. That's the part you didn't plan for. Marcus tried once more to steer the room, reaching for my hand on the blanket. I let him touch it for exactly as long as it took me to speak my next sentence, and then I moved my hand away, deliberately, so he would feel the absence of it. You don't get to comfort me for something you arranged, I said. Not today. Maybe not ever. Diane's face changed, just slightly, the way a person's face changes when they realize the woman in the bed is not the woman they planned for. She had expected grief. She had expected me to fold, quietly, the way I'd folded at Lily's birthday party, the way I'd folded at 100 dinners before that. I did not fold. Here is what I will tell you now, and what I could not tell you yet in that hospital room. What I found in those documents over the following 2 weeks did not just confirm what Marcus had done. It went further back than either of them realized I would ever be able to prove. There was a second form, and it had a date on it too, one that put a very different person in the room the day Marcus made his decision. My sister Naomi, who has worked in hospital administration for 11 years, was already on her way to Cedar Grove before I finished that sentence to Diane. I hadn't called her for comfort. I'd called her because she knew exactly which office kept the originals. Before Naomi arrived, the surgeon who had performed my procedure, Dr. Ansel Whitmore, stopped by on his evening rounds. He was kind, in the careful way doctors are kind when they sense a room has gone wrong, in a way that has nothing to do with medicine. He confirmed, gently, that the mass had been real, and the bleeding risk had been real too. What he could not confirm, what he seemed uncomfortable even discussing, was why the consent conversation about the hysterectomy option had happened over the phone with Diane, instead of, at minimum, an attempt to reach me through a secondary contact once I was stable enough post-incision for a brief conversation. That's a hospital policy question, he said carefully, not a medical one. I wrote his exact words down on the notepad by my bed. I did not know yet how important they would become. Naomi arrived with a legal pad, and the particular calm of a woman who has spent a career watching hospitals lose things and then find them again under pressure. She sat beside my bed, took my hand once, briefly, and then got to work, because that is what love looks like in my family, not speeches, presence, and competence, deployed without being asked twice. The first thing we requested, in writing, was a full copy of my medical records under HIPAA, every form, every proxy designation, every timestamp, going back to my first visit at Cedar Grove, 3 years earlier. Under federal law, a hospital has 30 days to comply. I gave them a formal request letter and a deadline of my own choosing, 12 days, because I know from experience that most administrative offices move faster when a deadline sounds procedural instead of personal. While we waited, I did what I know how to do. I built a timeline. February 3rd, Marcus's half-day for insurance paperwork, the day he picked up Lily. February 3rd, per the portal's audit log, Naomi was able to access on my behalf as a listed emergency contact, a healthcare proxy amendment, replacing my sister Naomi's name with Diane Voss's, submitted at 2:47 p.m. and countersigned by a patient services coordinator at 3:15 p.m. My surgery was not scheduled until March 21st. There was no emergency on February 3rd. There was only a decision, and a signature, and a woman who had no idea her name had been quietly removed from her own file. I want to say the word plainly, because it matters more than any other word in this story: consent. My original proxy form named Naomi. I had chosen her deliberately, in writing, specifically because she understood medical language and would never authorize an irreversible procedure without exhausting every conservative option first. Marcus knew that was the reason. He erased it anyway. The second document changed everything again. It was a consult note, dated February 3rd as well, time-stamped 4:02 p.m., 47 minutes after the proxy change was filed. It documented a phone call between Dr. Ansel Whitmore, the hospital's surgical liaison, and Diane Voss, discussing contingency options should complications arise during the patient's scheduled March procedure. In plain language, on the same day Marcus changed my proxy, his mother was already on the phone with a doctor, discussing what she would authorize if given the chance, 6 weeks before I ever went under anesthesia. That is not an emergency decision made under pressure. That is premeditation with a signature line. I let Marcus believe, for several days, that I only had the surface-level documents, the proxy form, the surgical consent, nothing more. I answered his texts in short, flat sentences. I let him think I was too depleted to dig further. This is what I meant earlier about intelligence replacing emotion. I did not need him to know how much I already understood. I needed him to keep talking, in writing, while he still believed I didn't have the receipts. He obliged. In a text message dated 4 days after my surgery, responding to my question about who else knew, he wrote, "My mom and I talked about it as a backup plan, in case something ever happened during a procedure. It wasn't a secret, it was just practical." I have that message. I have the timestamp. I have, now, the phone call log from February 3rd that proves practical meant already arranged, not discussed in the abstract. My ally in all of this was never a lawyer, though I am one myself. It was Naomi, who spent 4 evenings after her own 12-hour shifts, sitting at my kitchen table, cross-referencing hospital audit logs against my personal calendar, building a document trail with the patience of someone who has watched families lose everything to paperwork nobody bothered to read. She never once told me what to do with what we found. She only made sure I had all of it, clean and dated and impossible to argue with. She also taught me something I hadn't known as a lawyer, which surprised me more than it should have. Hospitals keep 2 versions of most administrative changes: the patient-facing summary, which is what I would have seen if I'd ever logged into my portal that week, and the full audit trail, which records who accessed what, from which terminal, and for how long. The patient-facing summary showed only that a proxy change had occurred. The audit trail showed that Diane Voss's contact information had been entered manually by a coordinator working directly from a note Marcus had handed her. A note Naomi eventually got a photograph of, still pinned to a corkboard behind the reception desk, months after it should have been shredded. There was a night, close to midnight, when Diane called my cell phone directly for the first time since the hospital. She said she'd heard I was asking a lot of questions and wanted to clear the air before things got out of hand. I let her talk for 6 minutes. I said almost nothing. At the end, she said, "You know I only ever wanted what was best for this family." I said, "I know exactly what you wanted, Diane. I have the timestamp." She went quiet in a way she had never gone quiet with me before. That silence told me more than the 6 minutes that preceded it. I also requested the nursing notes from the hour surrounding my surgery, a step Denise later told me most people never think to take. Buried in them was a line from the charge nurse on duty, timestamped 11:52 a.m., the day of my surgery. Family contact, mother-in-law, per updated proxy, reached by phone, consulted on surgical contingency, verbal consent obtained. Verbal consent, not written, not witnessed by anyone outside that phone call, obtained from a woman who had been legally positioned to give it 6 weeks earlier by a man who never told his wife what he'd done. Reading that sentence in a stranger's careful cursive made the whole thing feel less like a private betrayal and more like a system that had simply worked exactly as Marcus designed it to. Marcus still believed, that week, that this would blow over the way everything else always had. He underestimated the woman who reads guardianship petitions for a living, who understood better than either of them that in the state where we live, a healthcare proxy obtained through concealment, without the patient's informed knowledge, is not just a moral failure. It is potentially void, and potentially actionable, and I intended to find out exactly how far that word actionable could reach. I filed a formal grievance with Cedar Grove Memorial's Patient Advocacy Office on a Tuesday morning, with copies of the proxy amendment, the February 3rd consult note, the nursing chart entry, and the discharge summary attached. The hospital's compliance department opened an internal review within 72 hours. That is not slow. That is a hospital's legal team recognizing exposure the moment they see it. I also retained outside counsel, not myself, because a woman should never be her own lawyer in a case this personal, but a colleague named Denise Okafor who specializes in medical consent litigation. Denise read the timeline once and said 4 words I will remember for the rest of my life. This writes itself, Renata. Within 2 weeks, the hospital's risk management office reached out to schedule a formal meeting. They did not apologize outright. Hospitals rarely do. Not in writing. Not at first. But they acknowledged, on record, that the February 3rd proxy amendment had been processed without the standard 48-hour patient notification protocol that should have alerted me by email and mail. That protocol had been skipped. Someone, somewhere in that office, had let it slide, and now that omission had a name attached to it in an internal memo Denise obtained through discovery. Marcus's world did not collapse all at once. It came apart in the specific, unglamorous way real consequences usually do. His employer, a wealth management firm that runs background and reputational checks on senior associates every 2 years, flagged the hospital grievance during a routine compliance sweep after I named him as a party in my formal complaint. He was not fired. He was quietly moved off 2 client accounts belonging to families with adult daughters, pending review. Nobody at his firm explained why. Everybody understood why. A colleague of his, a man named Trevor who had been a groomsman at our wedding, later told Catherine that the office had started referring to the situation in careful shorthand. The Voss thing. The kind of phrase people use when they know exactly what happened but have decided it's safer not to say it out loud. Marcus stopped being invited to 2 client dinners that quarter. Nobody sent an email explaining it. Reputational consequences rarely arrive with an explanation attached. They just arrive, quietly, and rearrange a room around you. Diane's collapse was smaller and, in its way, crueler, because it was social rather than legal. Catherine told me, months later, that their extended family group chat had gone silent on the topic entirely after Naomi, calmly, without accusation, simply stating fact, shared the February 3rd timeline with 2 relatives who had been present at Lily's birthday party the previous September. Cardigan or not, casserole or not, a room full of relatives now knew exactly what Diane had arranged 6 weeks before anyone told me my own name had been erased from my own paperwork. Diane called me twice more that autumn. The first time, she asked whether I intended to keep punishing the family by proceeding with the hospital grievance. I told her the grievance had nothing to do with punishment, and everything to do with the 48-hour notification window the hospital had skipped. A fact, not a feeling. And facts don't require her forgiveness to remain true. The second call, she didn't speak at all for the first 30 seconds. When she finally did, her voice had lost the certainty I remembered from that hospital room. "I didn't think you'd actually go through with any of it," she said. I told her that was, in the end, the entire problem with her plan. I filed for a legal separation 11 weeks after the surgery. I did not do it in anger. I want to be precise about that, because anger is loud, and this was not loud. I sat across from Marcus at our kitchen table, the same table where Naomi had built her timeline late into so many nights, and I told him I was done managing his relationship with his mother for him. He asked if there was anything he could do. I told him the account was already frozen. The joint account he'd assumed I hadn't touched, moved that morning into one only I could access, and that the answer to his question had stopped being about him 3 weeks earlier, the day I read the 2:47 p.m. timestamp for the first time. He did not fight the separation. I think, in the end, he understood there was nothing left to argue with. The dates did the arguing for me. There is one exchange from those final weeks I still think about. Marcus asked me, near the end, whether I could have forgiven him if he'd simply told me what he'd done, that same week, instead of letting me find the timestamp myself. I told him the truth. I didn't know. What I did know was that he never gave me the chance to find out, and that the not telling was its own decision, made and remade every single day he stayed silent, while I planned a nursery for a future he'd already quietly closed off. I remained, through all of it, exactly the woman I had been in that recovery bay. Composed, precise. I did not scream at Diane in that hospital room, and I have never screamed at her since. I let the paperwork do what paperwork does. Sit there, dated, unmovable, indifferent to anyone's excuses. There is a particular kind of power in refusing to raise your voice for people who were counting on you to lose control. I never gave them that. The hospital ultimately revised its proxy change notification policy, adding a mandatory 48-hour patient alert with return receipt confirmation, a change Denise negotiated as part of a settlement that also included a formal written acknowledgement of the notification failure. I did not sue for the outcome of the surgery itself. The surgical team's clinical judgment, once the mass was found, was defensible on its own. What was never defensible was that Diane Voss should have been in the room making that call at all, 6 weeks after my husband made sure of it. Marcus and I finalized our divorce 9 months later. Lily lives with me during the school week and sees her father on weekends. Diane is permitted supervised visits at family events. Nothing more. A boundary Marcus did not fight, because by then, even he understood there was no timestamp on Earth that could undo the one from February 3rd. Denise told me afterward that our case became something of a teaching example at 2 other firms in the city, cited whenever a new associate needed to understand why proxy documents deserve the same scrutiny as a will. I did not ask to be a lesson. I have made my peace with being one anyway. Somewhere, a nurse is now required to send a letter within 48 hours whenever a proxy is changed, because a woman who reads guardianship petitions for a living happened to wake up early enough to ask the right question before the anesthesia fully wore off. I did not build a nursery I will never use into a monument to what I lost. I turned that room into an office. Naomi helped me paint it. One Saturday in early spring, both of us in old t-shirts, the windows open, Lily coloring on the drop cloth while we worked. It is where I write my closing arguments now. It is where I keep, in a locked drawer, a folder of documents that no longer make me angry when I open it. They simply remind me of what I built out of what was taken. Some evenings I still catch myself reaching for the version of this story where none of it happened, where Marcus never took that half day, where the proxy stayed in Naomi's name, where I woke up from that surgery exactly the way I went into it. I let myself have that thought for a moment, and then I closed the drawer, because grief and clarity, I've learned, can occupy the same body without one canceling out the other. Lily asked me once, not long ago, why Grandma Diane doesn't come to the house anymore. I told her the truth, the version a 4-year-old can hold, that Grandma made a very big decision about Mommy without asking, and that in our family, we ask first, always, no matter how sure we feel. She nodded like it made perfect sense, because to a child, it does. Consent is not a complicated idea until adults decide it's inconvenient. I did not win exactly. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think too many stories like mine end with a word like win, and it flattens something that deserves more precision. I did not get my fertility back. I did not get the version of my marriage I thought I had. What I got instead was clarity, the specific, permanent kind that never quite leaves you once you've had it. I stopped being a woman who could be managed. That is not a small thing. That may be the only thing. If you are the one your family has always counted on to stay quiet, to smooth things over, to be the reasonable one in the room, while someone else quietly signs your name away, I want you to hear this clearly. Reasonable does not mean silent. Composed does not mean powerless. The moment you stop explaining yourself to people who never intended to listen is the moment they lose the only leverage they ever had over you. So I'll ask you what I never got to ask Diane, standing in that hospital room with her pink carnations, and her certainty that unconsciousness was a vacancy she was entitled to fill. If you woke up and found out someone had made the most permanent decision of your life without you, and had planned it 6 weeks in advance while smiling at your dinner table, would you forgive them for the sake of peace? Or would you choose the paper trail, and let the dates speak for you? This story is completely fictional, created for entertainment and reflection, and no real hospital, family, or individual is depicted. If any part of it felt familiar to you, that recognition matters more than the story itself. Whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it quietly.